Absolutely, Naledi, thank you so much. A very important conversation coming out from the beautiful settings of the Cape Town Gardens at the Iziko South Africa Museum, where the Department of Science and Innovation is launching that Science Forum event that will be taking place from the 6th to the 9th of December, and just in conversation about science for social justice. So just a little bit ago, we were listening to the Minister Blade Nzimande, and he started off by just reading a quote from Nelson Mandela, and that's so appropriate because of the setting that we're coming out from. It's an installation in the museum, but it's a depiction of Nelson Mandela's cell, just in terms of its size and what it looked like at the Robben Island Museum. And it's a proper setting to start off our conversation that we're having this morning, that conversation with the Director General in the department, Dr. Phil Mjwara. Welcome and thanks for making the time this morning.
Thanks very much, Desiree. Thanks for giving us the opportunity.
And we also have Professor Muniba Isaacs of the University of the Western Cape. Thanks for making the time.
Thank you very much.
We also have Dr. Jothia Kara, who is from the National Research Foundation, talking to us about postdocs conversations as you're a fellow there. Thank you so much for making the time.
Thank you very
and
much.
From the Department of Education in the Western Cape, would like to welcome Mr. Ronald Engelbrecht. Thank you so much for making the time to have this conversation with us. Director General Dr. Mjwara, let's start off with you. The department making arrangements for this big global conversation, hosting 122 countries from around the world in the science community. What are your preparations? How ready are you?
Well, we're very, very ready. As part of those preparations, we had to meet with our partners that would be holding this event with. And in the last month, we finalized the 27 themes that are part of the program for the 3 days. And then we've identified and agreed on the speakers that will be participating in the event. So on that side of the content of the conference, that's ready. We'll now, of course, be printing the programs and all the logistics. The travel arrangements, we have a service provider who's making sure that that's sorted out, security is sorted, and then we are ready to go to the venue on the 6th, as you say. But the events will start much, much earlier than that. There are a number of side events that have been arranged because people are taking advantage of this large number of global leaders in science in South Africa that will be starting on Saturday. And then thirdly, we've decided, because we want to host the World Science Forum, because we believe we've got good scientific activities and research in South Africa, we will be taking some of the guests and showing them a couple of facilities that we have around the Western Cape from what we invest in science.
And there's many of those in the Western Cape.
Absolutely.
In the country, in fact. One imagines that you will incorporate something that was already there, but just really got a bigger pronunciation with the COVID-19 lockdown, the online aspect.
Yeah. What we will also be doing, amongst other things, we will be taking our guests to the big science facility, the radio astronomy that we're building in Carnival, and others will be taken to our Center for High Performance Computing not far from here. And then, of course, there is research that the National Research Foundation is doing here at Iziko Museum. So there are a range of these activities that our guests and our scientists will have an opportunity to experience when they are here in the Western Cape.
Professor Isaacs, when you think about science, you think about academics and high-level conversations, but this particular gathering forces us to come back to the conversation about social justice in relation to science. What is there to say about this?
I think that, I think it's very important that we connect science to social science, but just the examples that was mentioned now is disconnected from social justice. You find science, and science is very much in a ivory tower. We do our science, we do it well, and often disconnected from social justice issues. We're talking about inequality, we're talking about gender, we're talking about race, we're talking about class and marginalization. And to what extent is science really connecting the dots to that? We've seen in COVID what is the possibilities, but I'm not seeing that in reality that is happening in science. And that means we need to also look at how do we change our paradigm when it comes to science and making science for society and these critical issues that our society and South Africa is facing.
Dr. Kara, let's bring you in here. You're from the National Research Foundation, the very basis of science and research in South Africa. How are you engaging with this event coming up in December?
So we basically showcasing our science. We are letting the public know that, so as Prof. Isaacs has mentioned, yes, science is very isolated from society, but what we are trying to do as scientists is make our science more accessible to humanity and to mankind. So it's not only for scientists anymore, it's about showcasing and making this information accessible in terms of science engagement, science communication, as well as through exhibition practices. So for example, we're sitting in this wonderful exhibit in honor of Tata Madiba. We have integrated multiple disciplines within this sort of exhibition, for example, in terms of biodiversity. So I think it's more about trying to make that connection and bridging that gap between isolated science and humanity.
Professor Isaacs was also talking about science being perceived as elitist. And you work with that particular area that's considered as such, trying to just bring out PhDs out of our academic system, and that's good as well.
Yes.
How do we connect the two sides to make it work for the country?
Sure, that is a very complex thing to address, but sure, yes, it is through funding programs especially, so mobilizing funding. So for example, I'm a part of the DSI NRF funded PDP program, so that's professional development for postdocs. And through this program, I was able to get employment at this museum to conduct my research. But it's also about mobilizing the appropriate funding structures to give to institutions such as Iziko museums. So for example, we've been awarded funding from DSI NRF to develop our biodiversity facility and genetics laboratories. And this enabled us to attract funding, then to forge collaborations with historically disadvantaged institutions like the Cape Peninsula University of Technology and the University of the Western Cape, so that we can upscale these students from various socioeconomic backgrounds. So again, we're trying to bridge that gap.
And funding is a big aspect that comes out in the 2021 UNESCO report, but we'll talk about that later. Let's just bring it local to the Western Cape where we are. And for this, we bring in Mr. Engelbrecht, who is a representative of the Western Cape Department of Education. Mr. Engelbrecht, education is the very basis of scientific processes, but how does the Education Department work on whittling it down to students and learners, just in terms of how they have a better appreciation of the role of science in their educational progression?
There's in terms of the script that has been provided by DBE, which is what we call the CAPS document, there's the expectation that teachers engage more with the doing of science, with the knowing of science. In other words, getting learners to understand certain facts, but also see how those facts translate in terms of how it's been arrived in terms of experiments and those kind of things. And more importantly, and I think one of the things that's perhaps absent is the talking about it, where learners debate issues and engage with, for example, let's say the current situation of the electricity. That's one of the things that somehow, in my view, is absent. But as far as is possible, it is expected that we engage with those three components of teaching of science.
Dr. Jaha, we were talking about logistics earlier. Let's just take it into the work of the department. You were talking about a project you're having in Carnarvon. As we saw, you were in a partnership with NASA. Give our viewers a sense of the activations that the department has in relation to just bringing out science to the South African community?
Yeah, thanks very much. We've been very lucky in the last couple of weeks. As you said, 2 days ago with NASA, we launched, it was a groundbreaking ceremony on a site that will be built in Fontaine, about 2.5 hours from Cape Town, that will be doing the tracking and telemetry for the spaceships of NASA when they pass around here. This happened because in 1960 in Hartebeeshoek in Pretoria, a similar facility was built, and we've been operating this facility to track satellites.
And it's clearly working.
It's working, and it is for that capacity that we have in Hartebeeshoek and the competencies that we have within the space agency that then made NASA to choose this as one of the 3 sites where the tracking will be done. A week before, we launched a space weather in Hermanus. This is a center that will be, if you like, understanding the flares that come from the sun. Now, those flares can happen anytime, and if they happen to get to the areas where our satellite that provide communication and navigation are damaged because of solar flares, we won't have this broadcast if that happens. When you're flying, the pilots won't know where they are.
Welcome back once again. Of course, we're coming to you from the beautiful Iziko Natural Science South African Museum, where we're hosting a conversation about the upcoming World Science Forum that's coming up in December, just in an effort to make science relevant and relatable to our everyday life, especially considering the theme of the conference, which is Science for Social Justice. And let's just unpack that theme with you, Director General, just in terms of what it means.
Well, what it means, as you've heard from the fellow panelists, is that investing in science and doing good quality science is great. But if that science doesn't serve humanity in any way at all, we are of the view in the department as part of government that we haven't fulfilled our role, both as scientists, as human beings, as also as government. So we've also, with the little resources we've had, tried to see how that can be done in South Africa. For an example, we've got a huge network of researchers that are trying to understand the impacts of climate change in sub-Saharan Africa, not only within South Africa.
Very conversational.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So if you take, for instance, the effects of climate change and how the currents on both sides of the continent can affect communities that are relying on fish stocks, that science, if it cannot be translated
not responding
in
to
what does
challenges.
that mean? If it does not relate to the biodiversity laws and ecosystem services that are provided by our rivers and systems, it doesn't help anyone. So, and then in something very recent in South Africa, do we fully understand on the social sciences the reasons why we have so much gender-based violence and femicide? So we've spoken to one of the entities, the Human Sciences Research Council, to bridge the gap between the research they do in humanities and really get into the societal problem that we have. So that's exactly what we hope the theme of this forum and this conference would be doing, relating science globally, if you like, global science that we do, relevant to the South African context, but also making sure society benefits from what researchers do.
It will be really interesting to see if there are new scientific outcomes just in terms of the gender-based violence problem, because it's really huge in South Africa. But the Director General was talking about diversity, and I just want to read a little bit of something on this installation where it says Nelson Mandela immortalized in biodiversity. I don't think our cameras are able to just zone in on that, where it says the backbone to our understanding of the millions of life forms on Earth is the system we use for naming all these different organisms, and it goes down to list all those organisms, as I stated earlier, that we're coming out from the Nelson Mandela installation at the Iziko Museum. And Professor Isaacs, just in terms of the social justice issues, how do we say to a South African viewer now, this is how science understands that you're unemployed, to a woman about gender-based violence, that this is how science understands that you're unequal in this society? How do we broach those conversations?
We don't broach it from a scientific perspective. We need to understand this from a social science perspective, and we need to understand it from a qualitative methodology perspective, participatory methodology perspective. And we need to do it in a way that we do action research. We have to work with the communities, along the communities, and for the communities. With them is very important, for them is important, but we must also be sure that we get their voices. We need to understand the same amount of funding that goes into mega science projects, mega data. Is that amount of funding going into really understanding why we're in the state that we're in? We don't have to look very far to look at slavery, colonialism, apartheid, that created this base of gender-based violence, and that we also need to understand where our communities are at. I would like the DG also to maybe include a trip around Khayelitsha and look at what is the spatial injustices that this particular city created as an apartheid project. And that is also very much important in a rich, biodiverse city. So the most unequal city in the world is Cape Town. And we can't just celebrate the big science projects, the mega data that we are doing. We also need to connect that to a woman that is now being abused overnight by a life partner. How does she relate to that? We need to connect that, and we need to invest that, and we need to think differently. If we're going to continue the way science is going now, we are not connecting the dots.
There's your challenge, Dr. Tricia Kala, the National Research Foundation. How are you using your work to put emphasis on the conversations of society, the unequal society South Africa has, highest in the world, the just rising joblessness of South African citizens? And I know this is a global conversation, but we're trying to bring it back home in your work. How are you giving voice to those conversations?
So as a DSI NRF postdoctoral fellow, it is also part of my job responsibilities to train and upskill, for example, undergraduate students as well as other postgraduate students. So through my duration of being here, I acquired students from, like I said, historically disadvantaged universities like CPUT and UWC, and we upskill them and provide these skill sets to them and give them, we empower, we enable, and we give them the skill set to enable to carry it out in the workplace and to get those experience and that skills. So, yeah.
Mr. Engelbrecht, in the school situation, that's where the picture of inequality often comes up, when kids know there's a child who wears a branded techie that I can't afford, there's a child who carries a Kappa school bag when all I can get is the one I get from Chinatown, and those differences are usually expressed from that space. How's the department dealing with the conversation of social justice?
Desiree, I think I could just speak from the perspective of teaching and learning in terms of the social inequalities that exist within the context of the schools. It's perfectly addressed by learners wearing a uniform, because that takes away the inequality. But just in terms of science, where you try and promote the girl child in terms of the context of science, because those were one of the issues, I think, in terms of inequalities that existed, or still exists perhaps.
Yeah.
So we run particular programs for the girl child. For engineering, I think it's a particular field where very few young females are lauding. I think also generally in terms of science, and technology as well. So engaging learners in programs outside of the classroom is fundamental and actually quite important. Yeah.
I think Professor Isaacs has been itching to speak about this one, and let's come to the conversation that UNESCO has highlighted of financing in the area of science. We've just come out of the mini budget from Parliament, Minister Godongwana allocating 90 billion rands to the Department of Science. Is this enough for you to carry out your work?
Before I respond, do you mind if I just pick up on
Absolutely.
the point by one of the fellow panelists, the visit to Khayelitsha, around how our research needs to speak to problems that we have. And by the way, you're right, Desiree, to say that we may be speaking about things that are happening in South Africa, but some of these are global problems. You go to Brazil, you will see favelas. You go to, I've now learned that even some of the most developed countries, there are certain parts of urban
that we
areas.
never get to see.
So this divide between rich and poor is everywhere. So doing research in South Africa to solve our problems sometimes provides solutions internationally as well, and what this conference.
But sometimes you need a balance between the local problems, the continental and the global problems.
So within that, we've got things that we call living labs. So we then go into an area and try and have science innovations. Yeah, when I say science, I'm not talking about natural science, but humanities and social science. And then we look at how particular interventions can change the structure of the area in which we're in. We've got one in Beaufort. I think we've got one here in Cape Town, but I'm not so sure if it's
so the question then becomes, what do you make with all the data that comes out of there? How do you use it to help entrepreneurs to try and approach those areas?
Exactly, and how does that go into policymakers who can then say, here is a model that seemed to work, you've transformed this community here through these interventions, can we then take it up in the policies? Now, that's not for the Department of Science and Innovation. We try and influence that, but our job is to demonstrate what's possible and how this can be done. Now, coming to the funding issue, we measure the amount of money that goes into science through what we call gross expenditure on R&D as a percentage of GDP. Just to give you a perspective, at the moment in South Africa, we're investing 0.6%. On research and development as a percentage of
How
our GDP.
does it work comparatively with other countries?
Can I give you the country that perhaps you would be familiar with that is investing around 4.8%, the Republic of Korea? So you can see the difference between
That's huge.
the living standards in that country and ourselves. Japan is sitting around 2.8 and 3. Again, it's a very interesting country.
I saw in the report that China came in at 44% of their GDP. I don't know how that ranks with the other countries.
Exactly. China is ramping up. It started at 1.5 when it started to grow. Now it's sitting at around that value. So the answer is not enough. But we try our level best to make sure that the resources that we have and that we've been given, we demonstrate value to government, to society, and hopefully as you demonstrate that value, then everyone gets excited about investing a lot more. We have just finalized a decadal plan which Cabinet will be approving. We've identified priorities which we think are important for the country in the next 10 years. And we also have already support from other governments to invest much, much more on science. So,
Professor Isaacs, how are you engaging with the issue of financing in the research space?
I'm finding it very difficult to find financing for the work that I'm doing.
Tell us about that work. Outline it for us.
Okay. My work is on small-scale fisheries. I look at small-scale fisheries around South Africa. That's my base. I come from a fishing community. And then also I look at research and do research and have students of small-scale fisheries right around the continent. I understand what is small-scale fisheries on the continent, but getting access to funding to do the research around linking social justice issues, inequality, marginalization, gender, and their space is getting very narrow now. So you think of a community that is next to an oil and drilling company that wants to explore that, and then on the other side, you think of that same community as next to a marine protected area. So from a scientific perspective, we want to protect the area. From a government perspective and an energy perspective, we want oil and gas. From a community perspective, their voices are silent. They are not, there's not research money for that. Yeah. But when I look at climate change...
What reasons have been advanced for the lack of funding?
Is that first of all, science is being funded. And I'm talking about natural science, gets a lot of funding. Megadata is being funded. We want to know the megadata. What innovation can you come out? There's no innovation. It's social innovation. It's social issues. It's around social justice. It's around articulated people's, their rights, their access, their livelihoods, their food security. This should be part of a percentage of the budget that goes to deeper into understanding that research. If not, the DG is going to ask the same question in 10 years' time. How do we meet science with social justice if we don't invest in that, particularly, and to make that connection more deeper and not, I hear you saying we bring children from disadvantaged communities from these institutions of UWC. UWC is a leader in so many fronts, and social justice is one of the key research issues that we are looking at. So fund us more in our work that we are doing in social justice. This is land struggles about resources, struggles about, and that feed into the climate change.
I love that you and Dr. Kara's work has contrasting emphases. Yeah. How is the issue of funding or lack thereof just manifesting in your particular space?
Yeah, so we also have major issues with lack of funding as well. I mean, as a young emerging researcher, it's incredibly difficult for me to be, for example, a principal investigator on a research project, because that is only particularly reserved for more seasoned professors and doctors and stuff. So it becomes really difficult for a person like me to conduct my research without having an attachment to a professor or a well-seasoned scientist. But yeah, I mean, that is just some of the struggles that we face, and it's been incredibly difficult to overcome, and I am at a loss for figuring out how we can transcend those practices. But all I can ask for is more funding for us as young emerging researchers. Yeah, exactly. Because if we are not tethered to a permanent position, we are unable to get research funding, which is a huge problem.
But Mr. Engelbrecht, in your space, you're dealing with preset allocations. Is the issue of funding, does it come up in your conversations about research and social justice?
Comes up all the time.
Yeah, never enough.
Never enough, yeah.
How is it finding expression in your conversations?
In terms of what the province does, in terms of what we do in the district, it's intervening in terms of support that we need to provide where it's lacking.
Yeah.
And often the money is never enough, so you try and shift the focus on the persons and the people that needs to change and thrive. So with the little funding that you have, but it's always welcomed in a sense, if I can add to that.
So we're having a conversation about the upcoming World Science Forum that will be hosted at the Cape Town ICC from the 6th to the 9th of December, and I want to take the conversation back to the DG. One of the other conversations that come up from the UNESCO science report is just a lack of commitment by the global science community to women scientists who are contributing so much to this conversation. How's the department dealing with this particular South African problem?
There are three interventions. we realize that the problem is not only in the public sector, it's also in the private sector. We had a long-standing partnership with L'Oreal, who I assume you all know.
Their Women in Science project.
Exactly, their Women in Science project, and it's a project that is trying to recognize women in the research field who have done very, very well. And these things are very, very important because part of the growing of the women scientists starts from young people seeing, oh, I can also become a woman researcher and I can be recognized for this. So we've got that program. In fact, last week they were celebrating and recognizing those women who have really done very well in research. The second one is an initiative which we in the Department of Science and Innovation in the recognition of science, but it's got two parts. We recognize women every August. We've also, through a criteria that has been developed, that have done very well in research. And they, of course, they are being recognized and they get an amount of money maybe to complete their PhD or their master's degree or perhaps to go for a postdoc.
Particular research.
Yeah, and then the second component and the second expectation is that they will spend the year going to young women and, if you like, exciting them about science and imparting their knowledge, their journey at that level. And then the third component is through the National Research Foundation. The minister has issued a policy directive that at the scholarships level for masters and PhD, what percentage of the funding must be dedicated towards women, young people. And then they've got an emerging researcher scholarship program at the NRF that is dedicated a certain percentage, again, through the minister's policy directive of how many researchers or what percentage of the funding that goes to support researchers should be earmarked for women. So we hope that these are small initiatives, but hopefully they signal a direction and hopefully will drive an increase in the number of researchers. Of course, within the Department of Higher Education, which is, of course, part of our ministry, they've also identified what is called the Next Generation of Academics program, and then other programs that are dedicated for women as part of the emerging researchers so that they can have less time for teaching, more time to complete their PhD studies and further their careers.
Professor Isaacs, we recognize these women, they're shown around as a sign of excellence in the space of science. Are we going deep enough? Are we showing what the results of their work is?
I think that the National Research Foundation, especially in marine science, has done quite a bit in terms of funding for young women to do the research. I feel that a lot of women have benefited from the research, but when they get to a master's level, a lot of the researchers now need to decide, do I remain in academia or do I get a job elsewhere that would support my family? So
because of the social justice issues.
We as academics find it very difficult to attract candidates to our institutions to be able, and the funding is not a lot. I'm talking about a postdoc funding of 200,000 Rand per year. How do you sustain a family on that? That is not sufficient. Other countries pay you as a salaried staff. But I also want to say that I don't think we're going deep enough. In South Africa, there's a lot of white women that are benefiting from the science. But I was just come from a science forum symposium, which I'm also a board member of in Waihomsa, the Western Indian Ocean, and there were over 900 scientists from the continent. I think that the continent is showing South Africa up in terms of race when it comes to scientists. Madagascar, Mozambique, Tanzania, Kenya is excelling when it comes to science. We are not investing in our black women scientists enough. That is my
I see Professor
perspective.
Isaac keeps turning her head to the DG as she gives her responses, so he's right there, he's listening. Dr. Kara, I think you're almost a poster child for a young, female, successful scientist in the country. Do you think we're replicating that enough?
So yes and no. So yes, in terms of like like Professor Isaacs has said, I think in terms of women, we are not being given enough opportunities in order to sustain this sort of lifestyle and stuff like that. So I think that more resources need to be pushed into funding women in science and research so that we are able to pursue careers in a scientific environment, but as well as nurture families and support our families and stuff like that. Because I myself have held off on family planning or family making, just so that I can focus on my career.
Real challenges.
Yes, and it's a real challenge in my life because I'm going to soon approach that age where childbearing becomes quite risky. So I need to now take a step back from my career and decide, do I need to take a step back or do I want to continue in the path that I am at this moment?
So one of the conversations here, Mr. Engelbrecht, is a shortage of skills in South Africa. For the longest of time, we've been talking about STEM subjects in school, and science right at the top of that. What sort of encouragement of science, especially for the girl child, is happening in the schools?
Yeah, as I referred to earlier, it's become quite important that we engage with organizations like Iziko and other places to allow the girl child opportunity. Because within the context of the classroom, it's often a huge challenge in that regard. Promoting science within the context of within the context of the classroom becomes extremely challenging because of an overloaded curriculum, which is evident and it's currently addressed. The other thing is, of course, the decline in the numbers of learners engaging, and I think at the end of the year, the results are published, how many learners, girls have passed, how many boys have passed, and so far I think the girls are topping the boys in terms of those results. But it's a tremendous challenge currently within the context of education and the department to retain the number of learners taking mathematics and taking physical science. The other day I just reflected on a stat within a circuit. About 1,220 learners started in grade 10. Currently this year is about half of that. And that's the extent of the decline within the context. So every effort that we engage with is to retain that child since he starts. And obviously now the province is engaging in what we call a Maths Up program, where we, within the context of our grade 9 classes, trying to promote and ensuring that a lot more learners are confident, because I think part of the challenges within the context of the school is time.
Yeah, we're going to hold it right there.
Okay.
And hope you stay with us for a final segment of this conversation with Dr. Phil Mjwagha, who is the Director General in the Department of Science and Innovation, Professor Muniba Isaacs from the University of the Western Cape. We also have Dr. Jyothia Kara from the National Research Foundation, and Mr. Ronald Engelbrecht is a representative of the Western Cape Department of Education. Welcome back. You're watching The Agenda, and thank you so much. We've been having a really interesting conversation, if you think that's possible, about science, just in terms of looking forward to that science, World Science Forum that's coming up in December. A very interesting conversation with our guest, and we're supposed to wrap up our conversation now. And just as you make your closing remarks, I'd like us to have just a brief inclusion there about the quality of data coming out of our research processes as we undertake them, perhaps from a ministerial point of view. Dr. Mjwagha, are you happy with the quality of data that comes out of the research we conduct?
Yes, the quality, I think, can be measured by, is it useful to inform policy from our perspective? And just to illustrate this, with the investments that was made in the genetics and biotechnology, it's well known that the data that was collected during COVID
Was used globally.
was extremely used globally and to inform a range of decisions. Not only data from the sequencing of the genome of the COVID, but also on the data from how the society was perceiving vaccines and all of that. So we think the quality is extremely good.
Thank you very much. I don't want to cut any of our guests off. We've got 3 minutes left. Professor Isaacs, your perceptions about the quality coming out of South Africa?
South Africa has always produced good quality data in terms of the science perspective, and I think also with social science there's enough good data. How do we measure those data in terms of where is it captured in, who's taking it up, and who's implementing some of those results is very important.
Dr. Kara, we put the work in, but does the data that comes out reflect what has gone in?
Yes, absolutely, I agree. So that's mainly because with the research that we are now aiming towards is generating more sustainable practices of how we as a society can benefit from the natural resources around us. And like I said before, a perfect example is a museum activities. So where we offer exhibitions that engage the scientist that engage the visitor on a more profound level, giving them a glimpse into what our scientists do and how it can serve us as a community and as a society.
A lot of research also going into the work of education, not just provincially, but nationally. Is that impacting, is that showing out in the quality of learners that come out of the system?
It's hard to say because the time that research is published and the time it reaches the classroom or have digested there's a massive gap.
Yeah. So just to wrap up off DG, as we look forward ahead to the event next month, how can South Africans engage with these processes?
Well, we've got our website, the Department of Science and Innovation, and there's the World Science Forum if you want to be participating in this. And then, of course, there will be a lot of social media links to the forum, and we'd like to hear the views. I've benefited from the colleagues around this panel around some of the challenges that we as a department and the ministry need to think about. So that engagement with the general public and participating in the conference would be really appreciated. Thanks very much.
A huge thanks to our guests. We appreciate they do have a launch event to get to, but we hope you've gained something from that interaction from Professor Muniba Isaacs. Thank you so much once again from the Western Cape. Dr. Jotha Kara from the National Research Foundation, and Mr. Ronald Engelbrecht, who is a representative of education here in the Western Cape. And thank you as well to the Director General, Dr. Phil Jaha.